Hi guys, this is the last set of topics for global environmental governance where we talked about forest conservation and the future. This is a consolidated lecture given the schedule of the semester, so I'm going to break this up into two videos since they're really two discrete topics. We started off by talking about why forests are important and what kinds of goods forests produce, and then turned to the problem structure of forest conservation, before then discussing the trends in deforestation. After that, we reviewed the timeline of efforts to address deforestation globally, dating back to the late 1980s when this issue emerged on the global scene, tracing failed efforts to develop an international treaty, then global advocacy on deforestation, later turned towards forest certification systems, and then the emergence of conservation of forests as part of the wider climate change regime. Forests are important for a number of reasons. Forests provide goods for human use, such as timber, paper products, and serving as sites of recreation. Traditional societies derived other benefits from forests, such as hunting grounds for food, using straw for weaving, extracting honey, and other uses. Forests are places of biodiversity, so forest habitats are important in and of their own right. But forest biodiversity can also be used for human benefits, such as the development of pharmaceutical goods. Forests are important as regulators of hydrological cycles, so can be important in helping generate regional rainfall patterns. Forests are important globally at functioning as carbon sinks, which helps in the wider regulation of global weather and climate patterns. And then finally, forests are important in flood protection and soil erosion protection, so can provide important regional services in that regard as well. In terms of the kinds of goods forests produce, these include global public goods, such as the benefits of global climate protection from forest conservation in the form of a carbon sink that is a non-rival, non-excludable good that all of us benefit from. There are also regional public goods from regulation of hydrological cycles that provide rainfall and benefits like that locally. There are also private goods that private landowners derive from privately managed forests, where they are able to reap the benefits of a scarce quantity of trees on their property, for which they receive individual benefit. There are also ways in which forests can function as commons, in that large forested areas, particularly those that are in the form of public parks or national forests, may be rival in terms of the limited amount of trees in them, but also have difficulties of excludability. So there are ways in which those forests can be difficult to protect from outsiders accessing them and cutting those trees down. In terms of problem structure, forest conservation has some properties of a malign problem in some respects, but not others. So private actors may be highly motivated to manage forests for long-run benefits. So if they can maintain these forests on a sustainable basis, they can reap long-term rewards from forests, from timber and paper products. But that doesn't encompass the full range of benefits from natural forests serving as a habitat for species and providing other ecosystem services. And there, the forest problem, it becomes more malign, in that there are attributes of commons issues in which some actors will try to access those forests, but it's difficult to exclude them from entry without heroic efforts by governments to protect forests through monitoring, surveillance, and punishment mechanisms. And that provides some difficulties in actually carrying out, given that the countries that have heavy amounts of forests in the global south are developing countries that maybe have a weak attachment to forest conservation or weak state capacity to actually carry those out. There are extensive forests in the global north, but there also seems to be a trajectory over time of countries at different stages of development going through extensive deforestation as their incomes rise, and then reforestation later as their incomes have plateaued, and there are other sorts of needs and benefits from forests that people begin to develop. That said, you lose a lot in that interim from lost biodiversity if you have to fell your forest for development and then only decades later allow them to recover. And so there have been considerable north-south tensions in the debates about forest conservation, which have made the problem more difficult to manage over the last 20 or 30 years. But looked at over a longer 100-year time line, we can see how the forest problem may look a bit more tractable, particularly if we can come to grips with the impacts from agriculture and livestock on land use. So where are the world's forests and what are the trends in deforestation? Well, more than half of the world's forested area is located in just 5 countries. That includes Brazil, Russia, Canada, the United States, and China. So there's a significant amount of temperate forests around the world. But most of the forest losses are actually occurring in developing countries in the global south, in tropical countries. So 95% of forest losses have been occurring in those countries. Even in regions that continue to lose forests, rates of deforestation have come down considerably by almost 50% in Latin America and Asia, with the African region still being an area where deforestation has only slightly declined. In terms of what's driving deforestation, Hannah Ritchie focuses on the conversion of natural forest and shrubland to livestock and agriculture. Now, that agricultural category includes a number of different crops, including conversion of land for timber, but also for soy, as well as slash and burn agriculture that is of a small scale nature. The livestock category obviously emphasizes the importance of conversion of forested land for beef cattle. Only a tiny share of forest loss is attributable to conversion of forested land to urban areas. In different regions of the world, different drivers are more responsible for deforestation. So in Latin America, commodity-driven deforestation, which encompasses both conversion of land for soy, but also conversion of land for beef cattle, is the most important driver of deforestation. Whereas in African context, it's mostly conversion of land for slash and burn agriculture that is the most important driver. In Asia, it's also commodity-driven deforestation, but there the product is more based on palm oil. Some data sources disaggregate the drivers of deforestation into categories. So commodity-driven deforestation, forestry, shifting agriculture, which has more to do with slash and burn agriculture, are all distinguishable from each other. Urbanization is a slender share, and another contributor is wildfire. In different regions of the world, different drivers are more responsible for deforestation. So in Latin America, commodity-driven deforestation, which encompasses both conversion of land for soy, but also conversion of land for beef cattle is the most important driver of deforestation, whereas in African context, it's mostly conversion of land for slash and burn agriculture that is the most important driver. In Asia, it's also commodity-driven deforestation, but there the product is more based on palm oil. In the last few years, we've seen wildfire, particularly in Canada and in the Brazilian Amazon, as being some of the most important drivers of deforestation. As we mentioned earlier, rates of deforestation have declined significantly in key regions since the 1990s. Those trends are observed in core countries like Brazil, which saw deforestation levels decline in the first Lula administration in the early 2000s, ticked back up a bit, but not to the same heights after he left office, particularly in the Bolsonaro years in the mid-2010s, and since his return to office in 2023 have declined again, though 2024 was a year in which wildfire losses were more significant because of extreme drought. Like Brazil, Indonesia has had some success reducing its rates of deforestation under the previous Joko Widodo government. It's less clear going forward if the same anti-deforestation drive will continue, but nonetheless, that conversion of forested land to palm has decreased quite significantly. Other countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo face more consistent and slightly increasing rates of deforestation, mostly from conversion of forests for slash and burn agriculture, and that hasn't changed much. Canada is another country that has lost significant forests in recent years, particularly from wildfires. Colombia is another country where people have expressed concern about rising deforestation. Since the armed conflict in Colombia ended in 2016, areas that were once inaccessible due to violence to deforestation have opened up. Some of the armed groups have engaged in logging, and there's been an effort since then to try to come to grips with rising deforestation in Colombia. The new Petro government that came into power in 2022 has taken some steps to try to rein in deforestation with some success. Bolivia, as another Amazon country, has emerged as a major source of deforestation, and it may be a function of responses by loggers to restrictions on deforestation in Brazil at different junctures in history, and they may have found a more permissive context in Bolivia to operate. The agriculture and land use space is one that's responsible for a significant share of greenhouse gas emissions, and that includes when forests are cut down or burned, and when organic matter begins to break down, that it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It also includes methane emitted by livestock. Land use change, and forestry are responsible for a significant share of global emissions of greenhouse gases, somewhere on the order of 13 to 20% in the period 2010 to 2019. But that masks some diversity within this space. So that's going to include emissions both from the agricultural sector as well as land use changes associated with forestry. And the agricultural sector, which includes methane from livestock, is a higher share of those emissions compared to forestry. So by one account, that is about 11.7% from agriculture and only 2.7% from emissions from land use change, and forestry. Emissions from land use change, land use, and forestry come when forests are cut down, burned, or when the organic matter in those fallen trees begins to release carbon dioxide. The net amount of greenhouse gases emitted by land use change, and forestry is small, about 2.7% of the total of greenhouse gases in the year that I reported. But that net amount reflects both the gross addition of greenhouse gases from trees that are cut, burned, and where their organic matter is degraded and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That net amount includes that gross amount minus the amount of carbon that forests are absorbing in their organic matter. And therefore, that net amount is far smaller. The gross amount is much larger. The realization that cut forests are emitting a significant amount of greenhouse gases and reducing the contribution of absorption of greenhouse gases by standing trees means that if that rate of deforestation can come down, the forest contribution through absorption of carbon could provide an important source of emissions reductions going forward. There are a number of notable trends in forest governance over the last 30 to 40 years. This issue set emerged on the global agenda in the late 1980s during a heyday of environmental activism leading up to the 1992 Earth Summit. There was an effort to organize a forest treaty at the 1992 Earth Summit that failed. There were strong divisions between countries in the global north and countries in the global south. Activists from the global north were concerned about deforestation in the tropics. Timber companies in the global north were concerned about lower environmental standards among timber countries from developing countries, and countries from the global south were worried that a new treaty in the timber and forestry space would be used to reduce their economic growth potential and were a disguised form of protectionism. So they were not interested in a treaty mechanism, and that ultimately fell apart at the Rio Earth Summit. And then there were subsequent voluntary efforts through the International Tropical Timber Organization and other areas to try to find a path forward after that treaty failed. The International Tropical Timber Organization was unsupportive of robust measures to rein in deforestation in the tropics. It was dominated by either timber companies or countries with strong interests in continued exploitation of forests. And so the ITTO did little to restrain deforestation. Activists tried to boycott companies that were seen as responsible for the transnational movement of tropical timber from the global south to the global north. So there were campaigners who abseiled off the roof of Home Depot and other businesses to try to draw attention to the ways commercial products across borders were contributing to deforestation in the tropics. They later turned towards other measures that might bring a consensual development of sustainable practices in the forestry space, notably through the Forest Stewardship Council, which was a product of the World Wildlife Fund working with some private sector timber companies. That particular model was more successful in the global north, and the Forest Stewardship Council mostly had membership from European countries. There was a rival standard that was set up that was more business friendly in the US. And the upshot was that few companies from the global south that were responsible for deforestation participated in either of those ventures, and only a small share of the global market is subject to those sustainable forest management practices, which puts a label on products that consumers can then use to decide what products they'd like to buy, either in terms of timber, forestry products, paper products. And that's meant that these form of entrepreneurial advocacy by these coalitions have had limited reach, but some impact on forestry practices. We reflected on the differential success of forest conservation advocates in the global south in the 1980s and 1990s, comparing Brazil and Malaysia as two cases that were discussed in the Keck and Sikking book, noting that in Brazil there was relatively more success by local and global advocates for forest conservation compared to Malaysia. And that was a function of the fact that there was more international leverage over Brazil, which was coming in from the cold from its period of dictatorship and was seeking to improve its global reputation and was tied into policies in the global north seeking access to credit from the World Bank and other entities, and that campaigners were credibly able to mobilize actors in the US government and the World Bank to basically threaten the loss of foreign assistance if there weren't more robust efforts to address deforestation. That was a relative success, whereas in Malaysia, there was less dependence on international credit institutions, and there were fewer sort of points of international leverage, and local actors, in any case, remained in power, in part because of coalition politics that were more based on exploitation of timber resources. And so the Penan indigenous group that was mobilizing to try to stop deforestation was able to get the issue on the agenda, but had relatively less success with the Malaysian government that was more closely deriving its political power from continued use and exploitation of forest resources. More recently, there's been awareness of the contribution of deforestation to greenhouse gas emissions. I noted that while forests function as a sink for carbon, that the high levels of deforestation are contributing a significant proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that if those levels of deforestation could be reduced, perhaps at reasonably low costs, and that would be a boon for global greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. And so there have been increasing efforts to try to tie the deforestation agenda to the climate change agreements. So as I noted, there was increased recognition in the 2000s that a significant share of greenhouse gas emissions were coming from the loss of primary forests, and perhaps a low-cost way of reducing emissions would be through efforts to keep forests from being cut down in the first place. In the 1990s, under the Kyoto Protocol, there were so-called flexibility mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism, where countries could get paid for reforestation or afforestation, but they couldn't get paid for preventing forest loss in the first place. So there was a new turn in the 2000s, the so-called REDD Plus schemes from reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation that were intended to pay countries not to cut their forests down in the first place. But it was based on elaborate accounting mechanisms through carbon credit markets, first of a voluntary nature, and then ultimately, if a new treaty were to be developed that would allow for companies to get credit internationally if they prevented deforestation happening in other countries. The challenge, though, was that required some administrative capacity of countries to both know what the baseline level of forests were, what existing forest losses were occurring, and estimation procedures to know how much reduced deforestation was contributing to emissions reductions. And was that on a permanent basis? How could we be sure? And then how could you distribute resources that were gained from those exchanges to local populaces, both to support continued forest conservation, but also to reward them for their activities. And that required considerable effort by countries, and many of the forest-rich countries weren't yet ready for being able to manage such schemes. So the World Bank sought to provide technical support and training for countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo to be REDD ready, if you will. There were international transfer efforts supported by the Norwegians that were trying to pay the Indonesians and to a certain extent the Brazilians to try to reduce their emissions in this space. through reduction of deforestation. So there were already nascent efforts to try to compensate Indonesia, for example, for reduced deforestation. As time went on, it became apparent that trying to do this certification at the parcel level had really high transaction costs. And so there was a move to try to do this more at the landscape regional level and make the process more efficient. Meanwhile, after the 2015 Paris Agreement was signed, there were efforts to try to make sure that these credits that were issued were credible. And so there were a whole set of rules that took several years to develop to ensure that these carbon credits would be credible ones, because there was a risk of fraud and double counting, particularly in the voluntary market, where companies would sell these credits internationally, but use the same parcel to sell to different firms internationally. Over time, there's also the recognition that with pressures from climate change contributing to increased wildfires, that it's more difficult to ensure that this forest conservation is of a permanent nature. And so there's been something of a rethink of mechanisms to support compensation to countries that are forest rich so that they can sustain their forests over time. One other effort that was notable in the mid-2010s was the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, which sought to reduce deforestation to zero by 2030. And it sought to do so on a voluntary basis by eliciting participation from a number of private sector companies involved in beef, soy, the timber trade, as well as different national, subnational governments. And this was at a time in which there was global pressure to address climate change in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. So these voluntary efforts were thought as being part of the mix of successful drive for addressing climate change. Now, since that time, the first Trump administration came into office in 2016, and so the global momentum to address climate change broadly stalled, and some of those private sector commitments were never followed up in any significant way. So many of the companies may notionally continue to have zero deforestation targets on the books, but aren't taking meaningful action. And the return of the Trump administration in 2024 has meant that global efforts broadly are still more complicated. More recently, the conversation has turned to try to think about measures to reward forest-rich countries that are less focused on carbon accounting and more on just overall reduction of deforestation. And that seems to be the idea behind the new Tropical Forest Forever facility that was launched at the COP30 in Brazil in 2025. And the aim of that particular fund is to generate an endowment that would provide financial returns both to investors that support the fund, but kick off a significant share of profits and revenue that could be distributed to reward forest-rich countries. And so the aspirations were to raise $25 billion from donor countries and philanthropies, and another $100 billion from private capital. And together, on an annual basis, if that could generate returns in financial markets of about 7.5%, that could be split between investors and forest-rich countries, that if they're able to reduce deforestation to, say, less than 0.5% per year, then that would be enough to make those countries eligible for some of those financial returns, and shift the calculus of countries from getting rich quick by cutting their forests down to having a sustained source of funds over time from financial markets to reward standing forests. The challenge is that at COP30, they raised $6 billion of that 25 billion. And the aspiration from some of the major contributors like Norway was to get to at least 11 to 12 billion by the end of 2026. Even some of the countries that would be recipients of the fund, like Brazil and Indonesia, have ended up contributing to that 6 billion plus that's been raised thus far, and raises questions about, are they going to raise sufficient amounts of money to generate the financial rewards that would pay off significant funds to those forest-rich countries on an annual basis. It remains to be seen. Key countries like the United States and the UK have not yet contributed to this initiative, and as long as the Trump administration is in office, it's unlikely that the US will contribute. So we'll have to wait and see if this particular vehicle moves the needle on forest conservation going forward. Meanwhile, there are efforts by key leaders like Lula in Brazil to reduce deforestation, and those efforts will be successful, for as long as there are committed leadership. And so political changes with upcoming elections could make a big difference, and we'll just have to watch this space. So what needs to happen to address deforestation going forward? Well, first we need more data on where deforestation is occurring and what's driving it. And we have a number of tools now with satellite monitoring capability to do that more extensively and specifically than we ever had before. So efforts like Global Forest Watch give us that visibility on deforestation in real time, which allows us to see where problems are emerging. We also need consumers to continue to take active choices rewarding forest conservation, and efforts like the Forest Stewardship Council provide some modest signal in the market so consumers can know what are sustainable choices at the consumer level. Beyond that, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund hopefully will raise significant capital to be able to function effectively and provide payments for ecosystem services so that forest-rich countries can make significant money from protecting their forests rather than cutting them down. And we'll have to see if that effort is successful. And that's going to require mobilization of more funds from donor countries. There's also, the ways in which reforestation is occurring in secondary forests. And some of that's going to be managed forests for timber, but some of it could be significant efforts to allow for the regrowth of protected areas. And there may be more scope for recovery of forests than we give it credit for. I noted some examples of cut secondary forests in Costa Rica that in a 20 to 30 year timetable, we're able to show significant regrowth and recovery of some biodiversity. The final area is improved agricultural productivity, to use land more intensively rather than more extensively. And that's something that Hannah Ritchie talks a lot about in her chapter, which is the more ways that we can generate food and timber products more efficiently from land that's already been cut over, that will take pressure off the need to cut forests down that are primary forests. And so we'll have to see if that works. She notes some examples like palm oil, which has got a lot of bad press for being responsible for deforestation, is a efficient source of oil seed compared to what other kinds of oil seeds that are out there. And so are there ways of producing palm oil more sustainably through certification systems that simultaneously generate highly efficient sources of oil seeds for food, but do so in a way that is maybe more friendly to wildlife and at the same time avoids cutting down new primary forests for conversion to palm, but focuses on the most efficient use of existing lands for palm rather than cutting down new forests. So we'll have to see if these efforts are successful, but if we're being optimistic, Hannah Ritchie thinks that we can get there through more efficient production, and I'd like to think she's right.